So therefore, let's see how we can mock this fetch function away. For this, I'm going to add a http.test.js file, of course, and in that file we can start writing our tests. And let's say we want to test that we can successfully send a request and response data that is sent back from that API is in the end returned after it was parsed by this function here. That's something we could test. So we might want to test that it should return any available response data. That's the first test we could want to write. Now for that, or as part of that test, we of course want to call send data request here. And therefore we import it from HTTP. But we now must make sure that fetch isn't really executed, or that it is executed, but it's not the original fetch function that's built into the browser. Now in the previous course section, we would have imported v, and we would have called vmock. And then to vmock, we would have passed the module that should be replaced. The problem we have now, though, is that fetch is a globally available function. It's not imported from any module. That's a difference. Now we can have modules with front-end JavaScript as well, but this turns out to be a globally available function which is not imported. So we can't use vmock to replace a module. What we can do instead, though, is call another method provided on that v object. And that's the stubGlobal method. This allows us to replace globally available objects or functions with other implementations. And you use stubGlobal by passing a string as a first argument, and then as a value for that string, you use the name of the globally available object or function. In this case, fetch. So that's the name of this key, of this function that should be replaced. The second value, which you pass to stubGlobal, then is the replacement for this globally available API. In this case, that could be a function that should be used instead when fetch is called. So our test replacement for the fetch function. And here I want to create that replacement function by using vfn, so that I also have a function which has this spy functionality in case we need it. So here I'll add my own test fetch function, and that's then what I pass as a second argument. However, I want to tweak that function because I want to bake in certain behavior that makes our lives during testing easier. Hence, I'll pass this argument to fn, and then this will be the actual function that's used as a replacement for the fetch function for our tests. Now, the fetch function takes two arguments, the URL to which the request is sent, and an object that's used for configuring the request. Therefore, here I also expect two arguments, the URL and my options object for configuring. Fetch then also returns a promise, which is why I'm awaiting it here. Therefore, I will also return a new promise here in my replacement. So I'll pass this promise function here to the promise constructor, where we get resolve and reject. And again, that's standard JavaScript. And then here, I want to resolve to some dummy object, which in the end contains the response, the fake testing response, which I want to simulate, but also some other data that's required. So here I'll have my test response, which is an object, which is what I resolve to. And in this object, I want to set the OK key to true, because we're checking this key here and we throw an error if it's not okay. And for most of my tests, I want to assume that it is okay. I will later show you how we could switch it to false for some tests. And besides this OK property, I'll also add a JSON method to this test response, because we have that on the original response as well. And we call it here to extract the response data from the response. So the data that was sent back from the backend. And this also yields a promise. So in here, in this method, I also will return another promise, a nested promise, so to say, to which we pass this promise function which resolves or rejects. And here we then resolve to some test response data. For this, I'll add an extra constant, test response data, which could have some test key and some test data. That does not matter. It's just some response that we can use for evaluation later. So here in this inner promise, in this JSON method, I will then resolve to this test response data like this. So that's my replacement fetch function, which I want to use during testing. It's not the original one, but it does have some functionality which I need for my code to work, and it does have some functionality that allows me to test various things. And I don't want to use the original function because I don't want to send a request. So with this, we have this function. We're replacing the global fetch function with this function with help of this line. And we only need to do this once, and then all our tests will use this because, well, it was replaced globally. So our code now uses our own implementation for our tests. Again, the production code will not be affected, but for our tests, this will be the case. And therefore here in our first test, we can now finally set up some test data that's sent along with the request. And here I'll just add a key and then again a value of test, doesn't matter. And I pass the test data here to send data request. And since this yields a promise, we can then return expect and import expect from vtest, of course. And return expect wrapped around send request, and then use resolves to wait for the promise to resolve and then check the resolved value against something. Now send data request in the end will resolve to the unpacked and parsed response data. That's what our function does here. It returns the parsed response data in the end. So hence in our test here, we can expect the resolved value to be that test response data which we set up here. So here I'll check that it resolves to equal test response data so that it's exactly an object with the properties and the values set up here. That's what I check here. And of course I'm using my fake fetch function here, but with this code, I'm testing if my code that uses the fetch function does use it such that the data we get back is parsed by calling JSON and is returned. If we would delete this line or this line, our test would fail. With those lines being there though, this test will work if we run npm test because we did implement our own test function. And therefore again, if I go back here and I just quickly show you what I meant, if we would, for example, delete this return statement accidentally, our test would not work anymore because the data wouldn't be returned. And that is how we can now mock a global function like the fetch function, and it does not matter if we're on the front end or back end. Here we are on the front end because I'll show other front end specific parts later, but stub global is a helpful method that you can use when you're dealing with code that's not coming from a module and you still need to mock it.